Her finger pointed straight at the younger woman's face, close enough to touch. Pale pink polish, neatly filed, a hand that had never once known engine grease. "You want to know the worst thing about you?" Corinne Vance asked. Her voice dropping soft and soft was always when she was most dangerous. "It isn't your face. It isn't even those hands. Though I'll be honest, I've never seen uglier hands on a woman." Maren Vance sat still on the broken swivel chair, a roll of sandpaper still in her grip, not flinching, not answering. 7 years had taught her that flinching only made it last longer. It's that you think you matter. 7 years you've walked around this yard like it belongs to you, like there's somebody out there still waiting on you. The finger did not come down, so let me say it one last time, nice and clear. No man alive is ever going to look twice at something as useless and ugly as you. Outside, rain tapped steadily on the tin roof. Maren looked at that finger a long moment, then her eyes drifted slowly past the older woman's shoulder and her breath stopped. A man was standing in the doorway, shoulders nearly filling the frame. Rain still beaded on the wool of his black coat. He hadn't knocked. He didn't bother pretending he'd just arrived either. He stood the way a man stands when he's been there long enough to hear every word. Corinne saw her stepdaughter's gaze shift. She turned around. The sandpaper slipped from Maren's hand, rolled across the concrete, and came to rest against the toe of the man's shoe, and nobody bent down to pick it up. Corinne's face moved through 3 things in the space of 2 breaths. Confusion, then recognition, then a white so complete it looked like plaster. Because in this harbor town, everybody knew that face, every crate that crossed the docks, every crane, every unloading shift, every name allowed to appear on the shipping board along the waterfront went through him first, and he had just heard all of it. But this story doesn't begin here. It begins a few nights earlier, at the lowest tide of the month, when that same man dragged himself across the wet concrete of the slipway behind the yard, one hand clamped hard over a shoulder gone dark, crawling toward the only light still burning along that whole black stretch of water, a light that for 7 years, a woman the entire town had agreed wasn't worth a second glance, had never once let go out. If this story reached you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with whoever came to mind, and subscribe to our channel to walk the rest of this road with Maren. A few days before that night, when the tide was still rising and falling faithfully twice each day and no one along this stretch of waterfront had any idea what was coming, the wooden house tucked behind the boat repair shop still kept the same rhythm it had kept for 7 years. Darkness came early. Wind blew in off the bay, slipping through the warped window frames, and in the living room, only one of the 3 heating elements in the electric heater glowed red. The other 2 lay silent and gray beneath a thin layer of dust, showing they had been still that way for a very long time. Corinne Vance sat in the armchair nearest the heater, her feet propped on a worn velvet ottoman, a tablet resting in her lap. Her reading glasses had slid low on her nose. Her finger moved over the screen, slow and steady, stopping at each line. Maren sat about 3 feet away on an unpadded wooden chair pushed against the dining table. Before her was an aluminum basin of warm water. She had both hands submerged to the wrists and sat without moving. A thin veil of steam rose from the water. Outside, frost had begun to gather on the cables. Every morning, her hands stiffened like 2 pieces of dried hide, her knuckles refusing to bend, and it took that long in warm water before she could hold a wrench without dropping it. The skin on her fingertips had split into small, deep cracks that never quite healed, because if they closed today, engine oil and salt water would seep into them again tomorrow. Corinne began to read. She didn't look up. "Electricity this month is $720, she said. "Water is $114. Heating oil is $296, and they say the price will go up again next month. Trash is $48. Home insurance is $860, due quarterly, and this quarter's payment is coming up." Maren didn't answer. She didn't need to. A long time ago, she had understood that evenings like this weren't conversations. No one asked her anything. No one waited for her to speak. This was an accounting session, and she sat there as an entry in the ledger, nothing more. "Repairs to the east roof," Corinne continued. "They quoted $1,400. I haven't called them back. No reason to call them back." On the refrigerator door, right at eye level for anyone who came into the kitchen, was a hand-ruled sheet of paper. Its corners had yellowed, its edges curled upward, and it had been taped back in place so many times with clear tape that the overlapping layers had turned into a cloudy streak. It was divided into columns. The figures were written in 3 different colors of ink: blue, black, then red in the most recent lines, after the old pen ran dry and no one bothered to buy another in the same color. The last column on the right, written in neat, slanting handwriting, bore exactly 4 words: room and board, unpaid. Beneath it, the numbers accumulated, month after month, running all the way down the page and spilling onto another sheet taped beneath it. 7 years contained in a single column. There was no line for the nights Marin lay beneath an engine until 2 o'clock in the morning, replacing connecting rod bearings in fishermen's boats for cash. There was no line for the winter. She rewelded every pipe in the shop using salvaged material. That column moved in only one direction. It never went down. Corinne turned off the tablet, set it on the table, removed her glasses, and wiped the lenses with the hem of her sweater. She did it with great care. Her hands were white, her nails neatly trimmed and painted a pale pink, and in all those 7 years, they had never once touched engine oil. On the wall behind her, the breaker box was shut tight, and a small brass padlock hung from the iron loop on its side. The key rested in the pocket of her sweater. Marin withdrew her hands from the basin, dried them on the old towel draped over the back of the chair, then tried bending her fingers. This time, they gave. She rose to her feet. Around her neck, beneath her work shirt, was a thin length of nylon cord, the kind people use to tie down cargo tarps. Threaded through one end was a tarnished gold wedding band. She didn't wear it on her finger. It would get in the way there, and beneath an engine, anything that got in the way could become dangerous, so she kept it there, close to her chest, hidden beneath her collar, where no one saw it and no one ever asked about it. "You're going back out there," Corinne said. It wasn't a question. She still didn't look up. Marin slipped her feet into the rubber boots standing in the corner by the door, pulled the zipper of her work jacket up to her chin, and stepped outside. The door closed behind her. Inside, the single heating element still glowed red, and the woman sitting beside it never turned her head. That night, the tide fell to its lowest point of the month, and when it pulled back that far, the whole waterfront gave off a smell only people in the trade could grow used to. The smell of mud from the bay floor, dead barnacles clinging to the pier supports, and rusted iron that had soaked in salt water for years. Marin knelt on the wet concrete at the head of the boat ramp, her knees resting on a piece of wood to keep out the cold, a long pipe wrench in her hands as she tightened the bolt at the base of mooring post number 4. That post had been loose since the beginning of the season. She had told Corinne 3 times, and all 3 times, the answer had been that a mooring post wasn't included in the expense list, so she did it herself. At night, with the tools her father had left behind, the hail began to fall as she tightened the second turn. At first, it was only a few pellets tapping against the brim of her cap. Then, within a few breaths, it came down hard enough to turn the whole harbor white, drumming on the shop's metal roof in one unbroken sound, as if someone were scattering gravel over it. She lowered her head, pulled up her collar, and tightened the final turn. Then she heard it, a grinding sound. Not tires, metal scraping concrete, the kind of sound that made her teeth ache, long and drawn out, coming closer with every second. She looked up just in time to see a black sport utility vehicle tearing across the lit end of the lot at an angle, one front tire already gone, the bare steel rim scraping the pavement and throwing a long trail of sparks. The vehicle couldn't brake in time. It slammed into the barrier at the far end of the lot, tore 2 iron rails loose, then shuddered to a stop with its nose hanging over the edge of the dock. Its headlights were still on, casting their beams through the hail, and for the next few seconds there was only the sound of the engine dying and the ice striking the ground. Marin rose to her feet. The driver's door sprang open. A man spilled onto the concrete, bracing himself with one hand, while the other pressed hard against his left shoulder, where the fabric had darkened into a black stain. He didn't cry out. That was the first thing she noticed. People usually cried out when they fell that way, but he only breathed, deep and slow, then began to drag himself forward. He didn't crawl toward the main road. He crawled toward the light, toward the only lamp still burning along that stretch of black waterfront, and that lamp belonged to her shop. Marin didn't run into the house. She didn't reach for her phone either. There was something about that man, that vehicle, and the fact that he had not made a sound, that told her if she called the police, the first thing that happened wouldn't be his rescue. She stood there for exactly 1 breath to decide, then walked over, slipped her shoulder beneath his uninjured arm, and pulled. He was much heavier than she had expected. She dragged him across 40 steps of slick concrete, pushed open the machine bay door with her hip, and brought him to the cold metal table in the middle of the shop, the table her father had used to dismantle oil pumps for decades. She pulled down the overhead work light. Then she went to work. She cut through the fabric with tin snips because ordinary scissors wouldn't bite through wet wool. She took down the industrial first aid kit hanging on the wall, a green-painted metal box with her father's handwriting on its lid. A box that had hung there since the days when the shop had 12 workers, and someone in every shift came away with some small injury. Inside were military-grade gauze, rubbing alcohol, medical forceps, wound needles, and thread. She held the forceps in the flame of the blowtorch for about 10 seconds, until the metal tips changed color, then dipped them into a basin of cold water. She did everything in the proper order, without rushing. Those cracked hands of hers were steady now, because this was something she knew how to do, and when it came to the things she knew, her hands had never trembled. The man lay still, his eyes open, staring at the metal ceiling. He ground his teeth only twice. When she was finished, she washed her hands, pulled over a stool, and sat about 2 steps from the metal table, and the two of them waited for daylight. Those 3 hours passed almost in silence. The hail eased, then turned into ordinary rain. "How much do you want?" he said. His voice was rough, but clear. Marin looked at the open metal box on the table. "I used 1 roll of bandage and lost 3 hours of sleep. Pay me for exactly that, and we'll be even. I don't sell anything else." He turned his head and looked at her for the first time. "That light by the dock. Why does it stay on all night?" She didn't answer. "What's your name?" She didn't answer that either. He watched her for a while longer, then stopped. He turned his face back toward the ceiling and didn't ask another question. Dawn came as the tide began to rise again. 3 cars entered the lot, moving quietly, and the people who stepped out didn't speak to her or look around. They went straight into the machine bay and carried him away. The damaged vehicle was towed off first. When they had all gone, and the lot was empty again, Marin went back inside to clean up. On the metal table, beside a streak of water that had not yet dried, lay a horn button that had come loose from its thread. She picked it up, turned it in her palm for a moment, then slipped it into the breast pocket of her work shirt. The bakery sat halfway up the slope of Federal Hill, its storefront narrow, its glass door fogged with steam, and on its shelves were the same 4 kinds of bread it had displayed since the first owner's day. Outside, people stood in line for crusty loaves and almond pastries, while behind the shop, through an unmarked wooden door, was a room containing only 3 things: a long table, an old coffee maker, and a harbor map covering the entire eastern wall. Elias Barone sat at the head of the table, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his left arm held loosely at his side. Nothing showed beneath a bandage. Only the way he wouldn't turn his shoulder revealed that something had happened. Gus Petrosino set a cup of coffee down before him harder than necessary. "You went alone. At night. Along the harbor road." His voice didn't lower, though the other side of the door was only a few steps away. "You still remember where your father is buried, don't you?" Elias didn't answer. He took the coffee in his right hand, drank a sip, and set it down. The man who had sold information had been dealt with before dawn, and his name no longer appeared on any shift roster along this stretch of waterfront. Everyone in the room knew there was no need to speak of that again. What Elias wanted to know was something else. "The shop at the end of the South Pier," he said. "The one with the old crane, the peeling sign, and the deep boat ramp." Gus pulled out a chair and sat down, letting out a breath. "The Vance shop," he said. "You crawled there?" Elias still didn't answer. "Then you remember more than I thought," Gus said, and his voice changed, softening a little in the way of a man about to speak of someone gone. "Back when you weren't even tall enough to reach my shoulder, your father used to tell you that. Wherever the Vance shop light was still burning, there were no men belonging to anybody. He didn't say it only once. He made you repeat it until you knew it by heart." Elias looked at the map on the wall. For one very brief moment, he remembered that he hadn't chosen that place at all that night. He had only seen a yellow circle of light against the black water and moved toward it, and moving toward it hadn't been a decision. It was something already inside him from a time when he had been too young to understand why. "Hollis Vance is dead," Elias said. 7 years now. That's right, Gus said. He was halfway through welding a seam when he fell right there. This whole waterfront went to his funeral. He was the only man I ever saw tell your father no, and still make your father take off his hat to him. Not because he was strong. Because he wouldn't change his mind. Do you know how rare that is around here? Elias knew. He had spent more than 10 years among people who changed their minds according to the price of goods and the direction of the wind, people who weighed every word in their heads before speaking, to see what it might bring them in return. "So who keeps that light on now?" he asked. Gus shrugged. "His second wife holds the papers. As for who turns on the light, I don't know. I don't think anyone is still living in there." Elias placed 2 fingers on the tabletop, tapped twice, then stopped. By afternoon, the file was brought to him, tucked inside a brown cardboard folder, thinner than he had expected. He opened it and read very slowly, 1 line at a time, with the manner of a man accustomed to reading dock leases rather than the story of another person's life. The shop was registered to an unsettled estate, with Corinne Vance serving as temporary administrator. The bank debt was 3 payments overdue. In 71 days, it would go to public auction. And on the final page, fastened with a staple, was an unsigned preliminary agreement. The proposed buyer was a company called Harbor Line. Elias knew that name. It wasn't a company. It was a shell, and anyone who had worked along this waterfront long enough could guess who was inside it. He read that page a second time, then closed the folder and sat still for a long while. Outside, night had fallen. Gus had gone home at some point, though Elias hadn't noticed when. The only sound left in the room was the coffee maker giving a small click as it finally cooled. Elias rose, turned off the lights, and sat in the chair beside the window overlooking the slope, where the red brick sidewalk ran in front of the shop. He remained there until nearly dawn. 7 years, more than 10 years. It had been a very long time since he had slept through an entire night. Not since the night of the ambush, but since the night someone called him out, and he ran down this slope and found his father lying on the sidewalk beneath the very window where he now sat. And in his mind, every time he began to drift off, a yellow circle of light appeared again, standing alone on black water, along with a woman's voice, level and unafraid, neither pleading nor begging, saying that she had lost 1 roll of bandage and 3 hours of sleep, and she didn't sell anything else. And now, in that records room, Corinne Vance turned fully around. The finger that had been pointing only moments before curled in and disappeared beneath her other hand, and she held both hands before her stomach like someone standing in church. "Mr. Barone," she said. The first sound came out dry, but the second had already been coated in sweetness. "Good Lord, there should have been someone at the outer gate. I had no idea at all. Please, this place is such a mess. Let's talk in the next room. I'll make coffee. I have very good coffee. Have a cup and warm yourself." "You were in the middle of something," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud. It only carried the flatness of a man accustomed to an entire room falling silent on its own to hear him. "I interrupted you. Please continue." Corinne blinked. "Excuse me?" "You were speaking to her when I came in. Please continue." For a moment she stood there without knowing where to put her hands. Then she laughed. The sound came out warped and abruptly cut short, then died altogether. And right afterward, her voice shifted into another tone entirely, the tone she used when receiving guests at church. "You misunderstand," she said. "It's only a family matter. Little bits of bookkeeping. This girl, as you can see, she's slow. She isn't quick like other people. Her father died early, and I had to carry everything alone. I speak harshly because I care. If you have children, you understand. Some children have to be spoken to firmly before they'll listen." Elias didn't look at her once through any of it. He looked at the refrigerator in the corner of the room, at the hand-ruled sheet taped to its door, its edges curling, the overlapping strips of tape forming a cloudy stain, the numbers running all the way down the page and spilling onto another sheet fastened beneath it. He looked at the cover of the breaker box on the wall and the small brass padlock on the iron loop beside it. He looked at the electric heater beneath the table, its 3 heating elements, only one of them glowing red. Then he looked at the hands of the woman seated in the office chair with the broken caster, those cracked hands clenched together in her lap, and he realized he had seen them before, beneath an overhead work light in a machine bay, holding forceps in a flame while she counted silently. He said nothing about that. "I came here on business," he said. "The deep-water boat ramp behind the shop. I want to lease it. A long-term contract, part paid in advance, everything above board." Corinne's face lit up so quickly that it looked almost pitiful. "Oh, Mr. Barone. Of course that can be arranged. I'm the manager here. All the paperwork comes through me. Just name a figure, and we'll sit down and do this properly. Here, Please sit. Marin, no, Marin, go make coffee. Marin rose to her feet. She didn't head for the door. She took 2 steps toward where Elias stood, bent down, and picked up the roll of sandpaper lying near the toe of his shoe. She did it very slowly. She brushed the cement dust from its surface twice, straightened up, and looked directly into his eyes. You've come to the wrong place, she said. The person who can sign the papers is standing beside you. I can't sign anything at all. I'm only the useless, ugly girl. You just heard her say so. No one spoke. Rain continued tapping steadily against the metal roof. Corinne opened her mouth, then closed it again, and over the next 2 breaths, the sweetness on her face cracked apart in patches like old paint. Elias looked at Marin for a little longer. Then he gave the smallest nod, the nod of a man who had just been struck and knew he deserved the blow. Thank you, he said. I'll have someone contact you again. He turned and walked out. Corinne hurried after him all the way to the door, calling after him about coffee, about how the girl hadn't meant anything by it, about how he was welcome to return any time, and he never looked back once. Inside the car, he sat for a long time before starting the engine. He had gone in believing he was doing something kind, that he had come to repay a debt in the cleanest way possible, through a contract with terms and signatures. But that wasn't what he had done. He had walked into a cage, stood in its center, looked around, counted the bars, then walked back outside and left the door exactly as it was. And the person remaining inside would find that door closing more tightly after he was gone. He knew that at once, and he still drove away. Behind him, Corinne stood in the doorway and watched until his taillights disappeared beyond the row of warehouses. Then she went back inside. She didn't shout. She didn't say a word to Marin. She went straight to the wall, drew the ring of keys from her sweater pocket, unlocked the brass padlock, lifted the cover of the breaker box, and threw the switch that supplied power to the machine bay. Then she closed the cover, locked it again, and slipped the key back into her pocket. 3 days, she said, and went upstairs. On the 4th day, power returned to the machine bay, just as the sun came out. Late-season sunshine was rare and thin in this harbor town. It wasn't warm enough to take off a coat, but it turned the bay the color of white tin and made everything in the yard look cleaner than usual. Del Pruitt stood on the low scaffolding beside an old tugboat, a roller in his hand as he spread gray primer over the section of hull that had just been scraped clean. He worked slowly, pausing every so often to make sure the coat came out even, the way a man worked when he had painted that same boat many times in his life. Marin sat on a coil of rope at the edge of the pier, winding up the length of flexible cable she had just removed from a winch. Then came the sound of feet running across concrete, the kind of quick, uneven running only a child could make, and Toby burst into the yard with a piece of cardboard held high in both hands. Miss Marin, I finished my drawing. He was 7 years old, with a knit cap pulled nearly over his forehead and pant legs about an inch too short, because he grew a little taller every month, while his pants stayed the same. His parents worked on long-haul cargo ships, and came ashore only once every few months, so he lived with his grandfather, and everyone in the yard was used to seeing a knit cap running through after school. Marin took the cardboard. Drawn in crayon was a red tugboat with a smokestack twice the size of the hull, blowing out a cloud shaped like a flower. The water beneath it was colored in 3 different shades of blue because when one crayon ran out, he had used another. Is this your grandfather's boat? She asked. It's the boat Grandpa's painting right there, but I made it red because it looks prettier. Red is prettier, Del called down from the scaffolding without turning around. Gray is awfully sad. It's only gray because that's the color they sell me. Toby smiled, showing every gap in his changing teeth. Then he looked at the cable in Marin's lap. Teach me how to tie a knot. Marin set the cardboard aside, propping it against the rope coil so it wouldn't get dirty. She pulled a short piece of line from her work shirt pocket, the kind of line she always carried the way other people carried pens. This one is called a bowline, she said. Anyone who works on the water has to know it. Watch my hands. We'll do it slowly. She held the line up at his eye level, made a small loop in the middle, and showed him. This is the pond. The rabbit comes up out of the pond. It goes around the back of the tree, then it goes back down into the pond. She pulled both ends. The knot appeared, neat, rounded, and strong. Then she untied it and handed the line to Toby. Now it's your turn. I'll stand right here. You do it yourself. Toby bit his lip. The first time, the rabbit went through the wrong hole. The second time, it forgot to go behind the tree. The third time, he moved more slowly, whispering each step to himself, and when he pulled the two ends, the knot appeared just as it had in her hands a moment before. He looked up sharply. "I did it. Grandpa, I tied it." Dell set his roller in the paint tray, turned fully around on the scaffolding, and threw both hands into the air. "At 7 years old, tying that knot puts you ahead of half the 30-year-old men out there, kid." All three of them laughed. Their laughter spread across the empty yard, then dissolved into the sound of water lapping beneath the pier. Toby tested the knot, pulling hard on both ends of the line, then looked at it suspiciously. "Why doesn't it get tighter when I pull hard, Miss Marin?" Marin took the line and pulled it once more to show him. "Because it isn't the kind of knot that tightens," she said. "Some knots get tighter every time you pull them, tighter and tighter, until you need a knife to cut them loose. This one doesn't. Pull it as hard as you want, and it'll only hold. Then when it's time to untie it, you just flick it once, and it comes apart." She gave the line back to him. "Remember that. Some things can hold without being pulled tight." Toby nodded, though he didn't understand all of it yet. He tucked the line into his coat pocket, picked up the cardboard, and ran toward the scaffolding to show his grandfather the drawing a second time. Marin remained on the coil of rope, watching him go, and on an afternoon filled with sunlight like that, she didn't think about bills, or the brass padlock, or anything else at all. That weekend, Corinne brought a handwritten inventory list down to the kitchen and said that people would be coming soon to take stock, so the attic had to be cleared out. Anything that could be sold was to be set aside, and anything that couldn't was to be thrown away. She said it in the same voice she used to read invoices, then walked out. Marin took the paper, took a flashlight, and climbed the wooden stairs to the workshop attic, an attic she hadn't entered in many years. The dust was thick enough that her footsteps left marks. Afternoon sunlight came through the louvered window and laid parallel bars across the floor, and in those strips of light, dust drifted slowly upward, like snow falling in reverse. She cleaned from the back toward the door. Several boxes of rusted bolts, a roll of mildewed canvas, 2 life rings gone stiff with age. Then, in the farthest corner, propped on 2 bricks to keep it dry, was her father's toolbox. It was steel, painted green, with a wooden handle worn smooth in the shape of his hand. On its lid were his initials in white paint, H and V, written quickly, the paint running slightly at the bottoms of the letters. She sat down on the floor and opened it. Everything inside remained just as it had on the day he closed it for the last time. Wrenches arranged by size, calipers, a chipped chisel he had never been willing to throw away. She lifted out the top tray, and beneath it were 3 things. The first was a large yellow envelope, its edges darkened with age, with nothing written on the front. She opened it. Inside were 3 typed pages and 1 handwritten sheet, and at the bottom of that handwritten page were his signature and the raised seal of a notary, still clear against the paper. She read it. Then she read it a second time, more slowly, tracing each line with her finger like someone afraid she had seen it wrong. The entire boat repair shop, the land, the workshop, the deep-water boat ramp, and the equipment, all left to his daughter, Marin Vance. Just one name. No other name appeared anywhere on the papers. She sat for a long time with the documents in her hands, her heart beating slowly and heavily while her fingers began to turn cold. The second thing lay neatly coiled at the bottom of the box, a hand-spliced towing line, steel wire wrapped in fiber, about an arm's length long, braided by hand in an old 3-layer overlap that hardly anyone made anymore because it took too much work. Its 2 ends were wrapped in hemp twine and sealed with tar so they wouldn't fray. It was still soft. It had never been used. She picked it up, turned it once in her palm, then set it on the floor beside her without saying a word. The third thing was a black plastic handheld tape recorder, the kind that ran on small tape spools. The recorder everyone in the old shop knew, because her father never went anywhere without it. He didn't keep a journal. He made recordings. He spoke everything into that machine because his hands were always slick with oil, and he couldn't hold a pen. Beside it were 4 small tapes, bound together with a brittle rubber band. Marin took fresh batteries from the flashlight, put 1 tape in, and pressed the button. There was a burst of static. Then her father's voice filled that dusty attic, and she had to put 1 hand on the floor to keep herself steady. He read out measurements. Camshaft, 7.2. Replace both bearing shells. Weld on rib number 9. Redo it tomorrow. Remember to buy bearings, size 25. Buy 2 sets, Keep one in reserve. Because last time they were out of stock and we had to wait 3 weeks. Then he coughed once and stopped. The second tape was the same. So was the third. Nothing but measurements, reminders. The voice of a man standing in the middle of his workshop speaking to himself, sometimes with machinery running behind him, sometimes calling to someone outside, before turning back and continuing. By the time she finished the third tape, the sky had begun to darken. She put in the fourth. More measurements, more reminders, almost to the end of the tape. Then there came a long silence, long enough that she thought the tape had run out. After that silence, his voice returned, and it was completely different. Slower. No longer a voice meant only for himself. "Marin," he said, "I know you'll be the one who opens this box. Only you will open it." Then another silence. "I'm sorry I married her. I thought our home needed a woman in it. I was wrong. I saw the way she looked at you, and I said nothing, and that was where I failed. Not the wedding." There was the sound of a chair scraping over cement. "This shop belongs to you, not anyone else. I completed all the paperwork properly and had it notarized. It's in the yellow envelope right beneath this tray. Take it to a lawyer. Don't let anyone else see it first." Then his voice grew quieter. "I meant to tell you on your birthday. I kept putting it off because I never knew how to say these things. If you're hearing this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you while I was still alive." Silence. Then the sound of him setting the recorder down on a metal table, its plastic base touching steel. Footsteps fading into the distance. Then the hiss of an air valve opening, the clicking of an igniter, and the welding machine starting up, its steady whine filling every second left on the tape until it ended, and the button sprang up with a sharp click in the darkness. Marin remained still on the attic floor, one hand resting on the recorder, and she didn't play it again. That same night, across the city in the room behind the bakery, a single printed sheet was laid on the long table. Elias Barone sat in his usual place. The overhead lights were off. Only the desk lamp cast its glow across the harbor map hanging on the eastern wall, and within that pool of light, 3 men stood waiting for him to read. It had taken several days to trace that phone. It was a prepaid phone, bought with cash from a convenience store on 4th Street, registered to no one. It had sent exactly one message during its entire existence, then had never been switched on again. They had obtained the contents of that message from the receiving end, and now it appeared in bold at the center of the page, so short it took only a breath to read. "There's been a change to the schedule tonight. Mr. Barone will inspect the South Pier." Elias read the line. Then his eyes moved to the lower part of the page, where the time of the signal and the coordinates of the nearest receiving tower were recorded, along with a small map outlining the coverage area. That circle lay at the far end of the South Pier. Only 4 structures stood within it. An abandoned warehouse sealed up long ago, an unmanned pumping station, a row of oyster greenhouses with their roofs torn away, and the Vance boat repair shop. On the final line, they had added one more detail, that within that coverage area, the closest point of transmission matched the wooden house behind the workshop, specifically the front room that people in the trade called the records room. No one in the room said anything. They waited. At that long table, they were used to a sheet like this being placed before Elias, and within minutes, a name would be spoken. Then that name would disappear from this stretch of waterfront in one way or another. But Elias said nothing. He folded the paper in half, opened it, then folded it again. He sat that way for so long that Gus Petrosino finally pulled out a chair and sat across from him, while the other 3 men quietly stepped outside and closed the door. The rain had stopped. From outside came the sound of a flour truck pulling up at the top of the slope, men unloading sacks, a rolling door rising, the sounds of a new day about to begin on the floor above, where people knew only that this was a bakery. "What are you going to do?" Gus asked. Elias set the paper on the table and turned it so Gus could read it. Gus glanced at the message, then at the outlined circle, and straightened in his chair. "Good Lord," he said. "Do you know that woman?" "I know her face. Hollis's second wife. At his funeral, she stood in the front row and cried louder than everyone else put together." Gus frowned. "But listen to me. She isn't that kind of person. She has no men, no money, no one behind her. She's the sort of woman who goes to church every week and then comes home to count every dollar on the electric bill." "I know," Elias said. And he truly did. He had stood in that room. He had seen the lined sheet taped to the refrigerator door, with numbers adding up and never going down, the brass padlock on the breaker box, the heater with 3 elements but only one of them lit. People didn't lock a breaker box because they were cruel. They locked it because they were drowning in some kind of debt and clinging to anything they could still tighten their grip around. He remembered the way she had spoken about coffee, the way she had clung to him at the door, the way her face had lit up when she heard the word contract, lighting up so quickly it had looked almost pitiful. That wasn't the face of someone setting a trap. It was the face of someone about to drown, who had just seen a piece of driftwood float past. "Gus," Elias said. "Yeah. Does that woman know what she's selling?" Gus opened his mouth to answer at once, then closed it again. He picked up the paper and read that message one more time, this time slowly, and he understood why Elias had asked. There wasn't a single word in the message about the harbor road. No time, no route. It only said that the schedule had changed, and Mr. Barone would inspect the South Pier, exactly the sort of information 100 people along this waterfront bought and sold every week for a few $100s. The kind of information people assumed was only business. "No," Gus said quietly. "I don't think she does." Elias nodded once. He picked up the paper, folded it one last time, and slipped it into his breast pocket. "Then she isn't the person I need to find," he said. "She's only the mouth. I need to know who paid that mouth." The next morning, Marin came down to the yard earlier than usual. She hadn't slept. She carried the yellow envelope tucked beneath her work shirt, pressed close against her body, and went straight to where Dell was making coffee in the little guard booth at the gate. The booth had room for only one chair, a small table, and an electric hot plate. Dell was pouring boiling water into the coffee dripper when she pushed the door open. "Dell," she said, "sit down." He looked at her face, then truly did sit, because in 7 years he had never seen that look on her before. It wasn't happiness. It was something trembling beneath the exhaustion, something he had thought had gone out in that girl a long time ago. She set the envelope on the table, pulled out the papers, smoothed them flat, and turned them toward him. "I found these in my father's toolbox, in the attic. They were properly notarized. Look." Dell put on his glasses. He read the first line. He read down to where her name appeared. Then his eyes moved to the bottom of the page, to where 2 witness signatures sat side by side, and his hand stopped. She was saying something, speaking quickly, saying that she would take the papers into the city that afternoon to find a lawyer, that her father had left recordings too, that perhaps it wasn't too late after all. She had said that much when she realized he wasn't listening. His face had gone pale. Not the pale face of someone surprised. It was the whiteness of a man who had just been touched in the place where an old pain had been burning for far too long. Dell. He took off his glasses, folded them, set them on the table, and sat that way in silence for a long time. Then he raised one finger and pointed to the second name at the bottom of the paper, written in large, slightly slanted letters, the handwriting of a man who had held a paintbrush more often than a pen all his life. "Me," he said. She looked down. She read the name. Then she looked back at him. "You knew." It wasn't a question. "I knew," he answered. Outside, a tugboat sounded its horn somewhere in the channel, long and low before it faded away. In that cramped guard booth, water dripped steadily from the coffee dripper, one drop at a time, and neither of them touched it. "The day Hollis signed it, I stood right there," Dell said. His voice had grown hoarse. "In the records room. The lawyer sat on one side, and I stood on the other. He made me sign as a witness because he said there were only 2 people in that yard he trusted, his daughter and me. But his daughter couldn't sign because she was the heir. He swallowed. Then he died. I waited. I waited through the funeral, waited through the first month, waited for someone to bring that envelope out and read it before everyone, the way people always do. Nobody ever did. Why didn't you say anything?" "I did say something." He looked up, his eyes already red. "I went to ask her. I asked her straight out. She told me that paper was no good, that the procedure had been done wrong, that the court wouldn't accept it, that Hollis had written it while he was sick, and people might even question whether his mind had been sound. She said if I kept stirring it up, you'd be dragged into court, you'd have to appear before a judge, and where would the house find money for a lawyer? In the end, you'd lose the shop and wind up carrying another mountain of debt besides." He wiped his face with his whole hand, the way a man does when he isn't used to crying. "I believed her. I really did, Marin. I only made it through 9th grade. What did I know about courts and lawsuits? I only thought that if I stayed quiet, you could still remain in that house, still eat, still sleep. But if I spoke up, you'd be left with nothing. I thought I was protecting you." He looked down at his hands resting on his thighs. 7 years. 7 years I watched you soak your hands in that basin every morning. 7 years I watched you lie beneath engines, fixing boats for cash so you could pay for the light at the pier. And that shop had been in your name since before you ever got married." Maren said nothing. She stood there with one hand still resting on the table, neither pulling it back nor reaching it toward him. Dell drew in a deep breath, like a man preparing to go beneath the water. "There's one more thing," he said. "I kept this from you even longer." She looked at him. "The week you were in mourning. That week, I still came to the yard every day because there were boats still sitting on the ramp. One afternoon, I passed the window of the records room and looked inside." He stopped. "She was sitting beside you. There was a stack of papers and a pen on the table. She was rubbing your back, saying something so softly I couldn't hear it. Then you picked up the pen. You didn't even read them. You signed the whole stack, one page after another. Then you collapsed onto the table." He looked up at her, and his voice broke. "At the time, I thought they were funeral papers. I thought they were applications for assistance. I kept walking. I didn't stop." The coffee dripper had finished dripping. Beyond the gate, wind blew in from the bay and made the guard booth door tap softly against its frame. Maren looked down at the will, still lying on the table, at the 2 signatures at the bottom of the page, and for the first time since she had opened her father's toolbox, she felt a chill run down her spine. Maren didn't wait until afternoon. She took the yellow envelope, walked straight in from the gate, opened the door without knocking, and laid the 3 papers on the dining table directly in front of Corinne Vance. Corinne was eating breakfast. A piece of toast, a peeled hard-boiled egg in a small porcelain bowl, and a steaming cup of tea. She didn't flinch. She set down her knife, wiped her mouth with a paper napkin, and only then lowered her eyes to the papers. She read them very quickly. It took perhaps 10 seconds before she looked up again, and she smiled. That was when Maren began to feel that something was wrong. She had prepared herself for every response, for shouting, for Corinne snatching up the papers and tearing them apart, for her claiming they were forged. She hadn't prepared herself for a smile. "So you found it," Corinne said. She rose, went into the records room, and returned with the hard plastic file case she kept in a locked drawer. She set it on the table, opened it, turned over several pages with her fingertips, pulled one out, and slid it toward Maren with 2 fingers. "Read it." Maren looked down. The form was pre-printed, with small type. At the top were several lines citing provisions she didn't understand. Her full name was typed in the middle, and at the bottom, in the box for the declarant, was her own signature. The handwriting was shaky, the last letter trailing beneath the line. She recognized at once when it had been signed. No one wrote like that unless their hand had stopped obeying them. In the upper right corner, printed in bold, was a line containing only a few words. "Disclaimer of inheritance." "That week, I sat beside you all afternoon," Corinne said. Her voice was still even, still the voice she used to read invoices. "I told you it was an application for death benefits for a sailor's widow, that you only needed to sign it and I'd send it to the union. You signed it. You didn't read a single line. You signed the whole stack one after another, then collapsed over the table and cried." She pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, then reached for her tea. "Your father's will is still perfectly valid, sweetheart. I didn't need to touch it. I never hid it anywhere either. It's been sitting in that toolbox for 7 years. You could have found it whenever you wanted." She blew gently across her tea. "The only thing is, the person who stood to inherit it signed away her claim with her own hand. Who the shop belongs to is something the law decides, not me. I'm only the one looking after it." Maren stood there. She didn't sit down. She could hear blood moving through her ears, steady and thick, and a strange feeling rose in her chest. It wasn't anger. It was the feeling of missing a stare in the dark. She had been robbed of the shop. For 7 years, that was what she had believed. And that belief, bitter as it was, had at least given her somewhere to stand. Now it didn't. No one had stolen it from her. She had given it away herself, with these very hands, with this very signature, in a week when she couldn't even remember what she had eaten. "Look at your face," Corinne said. Then her voice changed, lowered, softened completely, and Maren knew that was when she was most dangerous. Let me tell you something. That night of the storm, everyone said your husband was unlucky. It wasn't bad luck, sweetheart. Men go out to sea in a storm because there's nothing worth staying home for. She set down her cup. Do you believe me now? Outside, rain had begun to fall. Corinne took the final 2 items from the file case and placed them beside the form. A one-way bus ticket to Bakersfield, a scrap of paper with a telephone number and someone's name, along with a note that said they needed a caregiver for a bedridden patient, with meals and lodging included. The bus leaves tonight, she said. When it does, you'd better be on it. After today, I'm not feeding you anymore. 7 years is enough. That afternoon, Marin packed her things into the leather suitcase with peeling glue at the seams, sitting in the corner. She packed quickly because she didn't have much. Before closing it, she stood still for a moment, then picked up her father's brass compass. It was heavy, its glass face scratched cloudy, its brass rim darkened by years of hands holding it. She carried it down to the guard booth and pressed it into Dell's hand. Keep this for me. Marin, keep it for me, she said, without looking at him. Don't leave it in this booth. It's too damp. Take it home. She meant to add that when the boy was a little older, Dell should give it to him, but she couldn't say it, because saying it would mean she'd have to walk to that house at the end of the street to say goodbye, and she knew that if she stepped inside, if she heard someone calling, Miss Marin, from the kitchen, then she wouldn't be able to leave at all. So she turned away. Night came early, and the rain fell hard. She pulled the suitcase through the gate, its wheels frozen stiff with rust, squealing across the wet concrete. Halfway through the yard, she stopped, set the suitcase down, and turned back toward the electrical panel at the pier. She threw the breaker. The light at the end of the dock flared to life through the rain, casting a dull yellow circle across the water. She stood and looked at it for a while. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked out to the main road. Del Pruitt stood in the guard booth watching until her shadow disappeared, completely behind the line of warehouses, and in his hand, the brass compass was still warm from the person who had just given it to him. He stood there for perhaps 10 breaths. Then he set it on the table, grabbed his ring of keys, and went out to the pickup parked beyond the gate. The truck was more than 20 years old, its rear fender rusted through with holes, its passenger side wiper broken off halfway. He turned the key 3 times before the engine caught. He didn't know what he intended to do. He knew only one thing, that if he sat silently in that guard booth one more night, as he had sat silently for 7 years, he would never again be able to look himself in the mirror. He pulled onto the main road and headed back toward the city. Rain lashed across the windshield. The broken wiper cleared only half an arc, so he had to hunch low, looking through the clear patch at the lower left corner of the glass, and drive that way all the way up Federal Hill. When he reached the bakery, he stopped right in the middle of the street, leaving the engine and headlights on. The bakery's front windows were completely dark, but through the crack of the wooden side door, a thin blade of yellow light still spilled onto the red brick sidewalk. He stepped toward it, and 2 men appeared from nowhere to stop him before he could raise his hand to knock. Neither said a word. One simply placed a hand against his chest and pushed him back a step. "I need to see Mr. Barone," Dell said. No one answered. "I work at the Vance repair shop, at the end of the South Pier. He's been there already. He knows the place." Still no answer. Rainwater streamed from the brim of his hat down into his collar, and he stood there, a 63-year-old man in gray primer-stained coveralls and mud-caked boots, on a street he had never once had reason to come to in his whole life. Then he threw back his head and shouted. He shouted that name. He shouted it a second time, then a third, his voice breaking in the rain and echoing between the 2 rows of brick buildings along the hill. Several upstairs windows lit up. The 2 men stepped toward him, and at that moment, the wooden side door opened. Elias Barone stood there, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, with no coat over them. He looked at the old man standing in the rain. "You're the gatekeeper over there." "Yes." "Talk." "She's gone," Dell said. He was gasping, one hand gripping the lamppost to keep from falling. "That woman threw her out. The bus leaves tonight. She's going to Bakersfield, going to care for a bedridden patient in some stranger's house, all the way out there." He swallowed. "She found her father's will yesterday morning. That repair shop belongs to her. It's belonged to her for 7 years. I signed that paper as a witness. I signed it with my own hand." Rainwater ran into his mouth. "Don't ask me why I let it stay that way for 7 years. I can't answer you." Elias didn't ask. He turned his head and said exactly one sentence into the room. then reached for the ring of keys hanging from a hook beside the door and walked straight out into the rain. Someone called after him, saying they should get the driver. Someone else came running out behind him with a black wool coat. He didn't stop to take it. He passed Dell, opened the truck door, got inside, and the vehicle was gone from the slope before the man carrying the coat had made it all the way down the steps. In the room behind the bakery, Gus Petrosino picked up the telephone and dialed a number. The call lasted less than a minute. He spoke 5 sentences. The first was the recipient's name. The second was the names of 3 ships anchored outside buoy number 4, waiting to unload. The third contained 2 words, move them to the bottom. In the fourth, he repeated the names of those 3 ships to make certain. In the fifth, he said thank you and hung up. By the morning shift, when the ship schedule board outside the harbor master's office was updated, those 3 vessels had dropped to the final 3 lines. No one explained anything. No document was sent. On paper, everything was perfectly normal, merely a rearrangement of order to better suit incoming traffic. But along this stretch of waterfront, anyone who had worked there long enough understood what the final 3 lines meant. It meant cargo sitting outside the buoy, waiting, and every tide that came and went brought another docking charge, another container storage fee, another late delivery penalty, costs no one could recover from anyone, and no one could sue anyone over. It meant the owner of those 3 ships would sit in his office, staring out at the bay, counting each tide, unable to do anything but wait until someone in a room behind a bakery on the hill decided that enough was enough. The bus station stood at the edge of the square, nothing more than a long metal awning, a few rows of plastic seats bolted to the pavement, and an electronic sign with half its scrolling letters broken. The inner-city bus had already started its engine, its side door open, exhaust billowing white and thick through the rain. The attendant was loading luggage into the compartment below. Marin stood on the steps, one foot already on the first one, her ticket caught between 2 fingers and soaked soft. Then headlights swept across the station. Elias's car slid in, turned, and stopped directly across the front of the bus, close enough that the driver had to slam on his brakes even though the bus had not yet begun to move. The driver leaned out of his window and cursed. He went on for a long while, saying he'd driven this route for more than 10 years, that he was already 40 minutes late because of flooding in the outskirts, asking whether the man in that car knew this was a bus station. Elias opened his door and stepped out. He didn't look up at the driver's window even once. He walked straight through the puddle in the middle of the station, his shoes sinking into the water, and stopped about 3 steps away from where Marin stood. She turned around. For the first 2 breaths, she said nothing. She only looked at him. Rain had soaked through his shirt, pressing the fabric against his shoulders, and his left shoulder held itself in the same rigid position she recognized at once, because she had bandaged it with her own hands beneath the work light in the engine room. No coat, no one with him. His lips had gone pale, and the hands hanging at his sides were clenched into fists, not to threaten anyone, but to keep them from trembling. Then her anger broke loose. "Who gave you the right?" she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the rumble of the engine and the rain. "Who gave you the right to stand here and block this bus, Corinne Vance? You think parking a car across the station erases 7 years?" She stepped down from the bus, and now she stood in the rain with him. "Do you know what this ticket is? It isn't a ticket. It's where I'll sleep tomorrow night. It's 3 meals a day and a bed in someone else's house, in exchange for cleaning and caring for a bedridden patient until the day I'm bedridden too. It's terrible. I know it's terrible, but it's the only thing I still have in my hands right now, and you just threw it into the street." Elias didn't answer. "You came to my house that day," she went on, and her voice began to shake, not from the cold. "You stood in the middle of that room. You looked at the refrigerator, the breaker box, the heater. You saw everything. Then you walked out. Do you know what that room was like after you left?" "No, you don't, because you didn't stay." The bus attendant had stopped loading luggage. Several passengers pressed their faces to the fogged windows and watched. The driver leaned on the horn once, long and hard, then stopped. "You're right," Elias said. Those were the first 3 words he had spoken since stepping out of the car, and he said them slowly because his jaw had begun to stiffen from the cold. "I went in there because I wanted to settle a debt in the cleanest way I knew how. I didn't think about who would bear the cost after I walked back out the door. That was my mistake. I'm not going to deny it." He paused. "But I didn't come here to apologize." "Then what did you come here for?" "I came to ask you for 10 minutes. Water ran from his hair down both temples. Only 10 minutes. There's a diner still open with its lights on around that corner. You sit down, have something hot to drink, and I'll tell you everything I need to say. After 10 minutes, if you still want to go to Bakersfield, I'll drive you there myself. Not in this car. Not with any of my men. I'll drive. That bus isn't the last one tonight, but if you want, I'll take you to catch it at the next stop. Marin looked down at his hands. They were still clenched. She looked at the shoulder he held so rigidly, and she understood that this man had driven across the entire city through the rain with an unhealed shoulder, without a coat, without bringing anyone with him, and now he was standing in the middle of the bus station for everyone to see. Along that stretch of waterfront, no one had ever seen him wait for anyone. She felt something shift inside her chest, and she hated it, because she knew she wasn't strong enough to keep it still. She pulled the wet ticket from between her fingers, folded it in half, and slipped it into the pocket of her work shirt. 10 minutes, she said, and order yourself a cup of hot tea. Not for me, for you. If you collapse out here, this whole city will blame me by morning. The diner on the corner of the square was the kind that stayed open all night for truck drivers and third-shift workers. Its red vinyl booths split at the seams, its tables covered in imitation wood laminate, and an old metal sign advertising a soft drink company hung on the wall, so faded that all the lettering had worn away. The owner brought out 2 cups of tea and a terry cloth towel, set the towel in front of Elias without a word, then went back inside. He dried his hair, dried his face, and left the towel on the chair beside him. Steam rose from the 2 cups between them. I'll get straight to it, he said. I'm not good at circling around things, and you don't have time to listen. You have 9 minutes left. For 10 years, I've sat at the head of a long table, he said. Every day, people come to talk to me. None of them tells the truth. Not because they're bad people, because before they open their mouths, they've already done the math, worked out what they'll gain from saying one thing and what they'll lose from saying another. Even compliments, even questions about someone's health. I sit in the middle of people weighing every word before they let it fall. And I've sat there so long I forgot people could speak to one another any other way. He turned his teacup once on the tabletop. That night in the engine room, I asked you how much you wanted. Do you know what I was thinking? I thought you'd name a high number. Then I'd pay double, and that would settle everything. That's how I've always dealt with everyone. Do you think I'm stupid? No. I thought you'd be like them. You're the first person who's ever looked me in the face without calculating the interest. Marin said nothing. She looked down at her tea. Beyond the window, the bus had pulled away some time ago, its 2 red taillights blurring in the rain before vanishing around the bend. She watched it go. She didn't feel as panicked as she had expected. If you want to hear something true, then I'll tell you this, she said. She drew the cord from around her neck, held the dull gold ring between 2 fingers, then let it slip back beneath her collar. I had a husband once. He was an assistant mechanic on a tugboat. A good man. Everyone at the yard said I was lucky. In 2 years of marriage, we never had a single argument. She looked up. Do you know why we never argued? Because I never argued. Whatever he said, I nodded. When he came home late, I didn't ask. When he signed on for another run, I didn't ask. I thought silence meant peace. I thought the smaller I made myself, the easier it would be to live in that house. She paused. When he died, I sat in that room and realized I knew nothing about him. I didn't know what he was afraid of. I didn't know whether he wanted to leave the work and do something else. I didn't know why he took that night run. Her voice was very flat. And he didn't know anything about me, either. I never told him. 2 people live beneath the same roof for 2 years, treat each other kindly in every way, and neither one manages to hold on to the other. That's where I failed. Not him. Elias sat quietly. Then he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a checkbook damp around the edges, opened it, wrote, tore out the check, and pushed it across the table toward her. The entire bank debt on the yard, plus a reserve, he said. Take this uptown tomorrow morning, and it's done. No interest. No deadline. I don't need you to repay it. Marin looked at the check. She looked at it for a long time. Then she pushed it back toward him with 1 finger. No. You understand what that amount means for you, don't you? I do, she said. I understand better than you think. But I've already been saved once, Mr. Barone. 7 years ago, a woman sat down beside me when I could no longer hold a pen, and she told me she would take care of everything. that I should rest. I was grateful to her. Truly grateful. She placed both hands on the table. The cost of being saved that time was losing my father's repair shop. So if you hand me this piece of paper now, I'll spend the rest of my life as someone you saved. I'm not trading one creditor for another. I can't do it anymore. Elias looked at her. Then he did something no one along that stretch of waterfront had ever seen him do. He picked up the check, tore it in half, tore it into quarters, and dropped the scraps into the ashtray at the edge of the table. Then we'll talk business, he said. He pulled a napkin from the dispenser, smoothed it flat, and borrowed the pen tucked into the diner owner's apron pocket. He wrote. The tenant was his company. The lessor was Vance Ship Repair. The subject of the lease was the Deepwater Slipway and priority docking rights. The term was 5 years. Rent for the first 2 years would be paid in advance upon signing, with the remainder divided into quarterly payments. Maintenance would be the lessor's responsibility, and billed separately according to the actual volume of work. He even wrote in a penalty clause if the tenant ended the agreement early. Then he turned the napkin around and slid it toward her. This isn't a handout, he said. I need a deep water dock on the south side, and there's only one along this stretch. You have something I need, and I'll pay you for it. If you want, take it to a lawyer tomorrow and have every line reviewed. I won't change a word. Marin read the entire napkin, slowly, twice. Then she picked up the pen. She paused for 1 second before putting it to paper, because it was the first time in 7 years that she had signed something knowing exactly what it said. She signed. Beneath her signature, in firm, square handwriting, she added one more line. Owner, Vance Ship Repair. The lawyer uptown read the napkin agreement in full, read the will, listened to an entire tape, then set down his glasses and told Marin that the inheritance disclaimer could be invalidated if they could prove the person who signed it had been deceived about the nature of the document. To prove that, they needed someone who had been present that day to testify, and they needed a hearing before the bank brought down its hammer. He filed for a stay that very afternoon. The application was accepted. The hearing was set for the exact morning of the auction, which meant that if Marin appeared and Dell appeared, the auction would stop. But if she didn't appear, the hammer would fall and everything would end there. The night before that morning, Marin stayed at the yard to prepare the papers. She spread them all across the cold workbench in the engine room: the will, the laminated napkin agreement, 4 tape recordings, and a copy of the application for a stay. She arranged them in the order they would need to be presented. Then the lights went out. Not flickering. They went out all at once, cleanly, and the whole engine room sank into the kind of dense darkness only a sheet metal workshop could hold. So dark she couldn't see the hand she raised in front of her face. Outside, she heard the cover of the breaker box slam shut at the station, the scrape of iron chain dragged over concrete, the sharp click of a padlock at the main gate. Then engines started, 2 of them, and tires rolled farther and farther away toward the main road. After that came silence. She stood still in the dark for perhaps 10 breaths, listening. No footsteps. No one had stayed behind. They didn't need to. They only needed to keep her in there until sunrise. She followed the edge of the workbench, gathered all the papers and the 4 tapes, and put them into an oilcloth tool bag used for ship work. She twisted the top of the bag 3 times and tied it tight. She found the flashlight in the bottom drawer. It still worked, casting a weak yellow beam, enough to see only a few steps ahead. She went to the workshop door. The rolling door had been bolted from the outside. She went to the side door. It was the same. She walked around to the office window, its iron frame welded shut in her father's day, because tools had been stolen too often back then. She stopped in the middle of the engine room, turned off the flashlight to save its power, and thought. And in that darkness, she remembered something the people who had locked the gate surely didn't know, because to know it, they would have had to lie beneath a ship's hull on that slipway, had to crawl into that oil pit at high tide, had to hear her father curse that damned pipe for clogging again. Beneath the floor of the engine room, in the western corner, there was a round cast-iron cover. Under it was a circulating water tunnel that ran straight out to the slipway, a tunnel built back when the yard still used seawater for its cooling system. It was just wide enough for one person to crouch through, and it opened at the foot of the slipway, beneath the water at high tide and exposed at low tide. Tonight, the tide was going out. She turned on the flashlight, took the iron hook from the toolbox, and pried up the cast-iron cover. A rush of cold air and the smell of bottom mud struck her face. She tied the oilcloth bag over her shoulder, gripped the flashlight between her teeth, and climbed down. The water reached her chest with the very first step. It was so cold that for the first few seconds she couldn't breathe. Her chest seized tight, and she had to stand still, holding onto the concrete wall until her lungs would open again. The tunnel ceiling was low. She had to bend nearly double, and with every step, the mud on the bottom sank beneath her boots. Both concrete walls were coated in barnacles sharp as broken porcelain, and she held on with those cracked hands of hers, skin that never quite healed all year long, while the salt water bit into every fissure and sent pain shooting up to her elbows. She didn't stop. She counted. 30 steps brought her to the branch pipe that turned left. 60 steps brought her to the place where the ceiling dropped lower, and she had to move on her knees. 90 steps brought the sound of water slapping against stone, and that sound meant the open bay was ahead. At the final stretch, the water rose nearly to the ceiling where the tunnel floor dipped, and she had to tilt back her head, press her nose into the thin strip of air left between the water and the concrete, and move forward one step at a time, holding the oilcloth bag above her head with one hand. The flashlight slipped from her mouth, fell, sank, and went dark. Then she saw a patch of gray ahead. She felt her way toward it and crawled out through the tunnel mouth at the base of the slipway, submerged to her shoulders in water cold enough to numb her, both hands bleeding and so numb she could no longer feel them. She clung to the iron ladder fixed to the dock wall, climbed up, and lay face down on the concrete, breathing. Above her, the light at the end of the slipway was still burning. To the east, the horizon had begun to soften into a pale gray. Maren didn't lie there for long. She turned herself over, crawled to the nearest mooring post, hung the oilcloth bag from it to keep it from getting any wetter, then pushed herself to her feet. Her whole body shook violently, her teeth chattering, but her legs still worked, and she walked straight toward the end of the slipway, where the old floating dry dock had been moored since her father's time. Out in the channel, she could already hear ship engines. In the gray light of dawn, she saw 2 tugboats moving in, guiding a cargo barge, their bows aimed straight at the mouth of the yard. They had come even earlier than the auction. They meant to move in and take the berth first, so that by the time the hammer fell, someone else's vessel would already be sitting in the yard, and anyone who had something to say could say it too late. Maren climbed onto the dry dock. She knew it better than she knew the wooden house behind the yard. It was a hollow steel basin as long as 2 tugboats, with ballast chambers on either side. When lowered, it sank so a vessel could come to rest inside it. When the water was pumped out, it rose and lifted the vessel clear of the surface. Her father had maintained it for 30 years. She opened the valve chamber. She didn't sink it. She did exactly what any shipyard worker would do when putting a dry dock into a maintenance cycle. She opened the ballast valves to let water into the 2 center chambers, lowered the dock into the proper position, waited until it settled fully onto the row of concrete supports below the basin, and when she felt the sound of steel meeting concrete travel up through the soles of her boots, she went to the locking chamber and pulled out the safety pins. She pulled both of them. She slipped them into the breast pocket of her work shirt. From that moment on, the floating dock lay dead on its supports, blocking the entire only deep water channel into the yard. And under the harbor authority rules everyone along this waterfront knew by heart, a floating dock lowered onto its supports with its locking pins removed was considered a structure undergoing inspection. No one was permitted to put the pins back. No one was permitted to pump out the water. It could only be released once a harbor inspector came down in person, examined it, and signed the report. And inspectors worked regular business hours, while this morning's business hours would begin after the hearing uptown had already opened. The 2 tugboats reached the mouth of the yard and had to stop. A horn sounded. Men shouted through handheld loudspeakers. Then several people jumped onto the pier. What followed was something Maren would later remember only as sound, the hard soles of boots pounding across the iron deck of the pier, a loudspeaker shrieking and then going silent, someone calling someone else's name, a beam from one tugboat's spotlight sweeping across the yard and then sweeping back again, and in the middle of all that noise, her own voice raised high as she said the dry dock's pins had already been removed, that anyone who touched it would answer to the harbor authority, that they were welcome to call an inspector down there. Someone shoved her. Someone pulled her away. One man slipped at the edge of the pier and fell into the water, and at once 2 others dropped flat and reached out with a boat hook, pulling him up within a few breaths. Soaked through and coughing violently but unharmed, Then headlights appeared from the main road, many of them, and everything stopped. Daylight had fully come when Elias Barone stepped onto the pier. He wore a black wool coat and polished shoes, and he crossed that wet iron surface with the bearing of a man who had no reason to hurry. His people spread out on either side. Every sound gradually died away. At the end of the pier, a man somewhere past 40 in a dark blue oilskin coat was being held between two others, and he was still trying to say something until he saw who was coming, then fell silent. Emmett Crawl. Elias walked toward him. Marin stood leaning against a mooring post, both arms wrapped around her shoulders to keep from shaking, and watched. Then she saw his face. It was the first time she had looked at that face, and failed to recognize the man who had sat in the diner the night before, the man who had dried his hair with the owner's terry cloth towel, torn a check in half, and written a contract on a napkin. There was nothing on his face now. No anger, no coldness, only a complete absence, the expression of a man who had made his decision long ago and was now simply walking toward the place where it needed to be carried out. She understood at once what was about to happen at the end of that pier. She didn't shout. She didn't run toward him either. She only stepped forward twice, far enough for him to see her, and spoke, her voice rough from the cold but every word clear. "Mr. Barone." He stopped. He didn't turn all the way around, only turned his head. "If you do that here," she said, "then from tomorrow on, this yard will be the place where it happened. Forever. People will pass by and point. They won't call it Vance Ship Repair anymore. They'll call it something else." She swallowed. "My father built this place over 30 years. He poured every yard of concrete himself. I just lost the yard, lost the paper, lost 7 years. Are you going to take this place from me too?" No one moved. Water struck the foot of the dock in a steady rhythm, the tide beginning to rise again. Elias stood there for a long time, long enough that people behind him began looking at one another. Then he stepped back. Only one step, but everyone on the pier heard the sound of his soul sliding across the wet iron. He turned toward his men. "Call the harbor authority," he said. "Report that a vessel attempted to dock at a yard under inspection. Tell them to come down and make a report. And call harbor police, too." The hearing uptown ended before lunchtime. Del Pruitt sat in the witness chair with both hands on his knees, and he told it in the same voice he used out at the yard, that he had signed as a witness to the will, that he had been there at the records office window that afternoon, that a stack of papers and a pen had been on the desk, and the person signing hadn't read a single line. When he finished, he took off his glasses to clean them, and he cleaned them for a very long time. The inheritance disclaimer was declared invalid on the spot. The auction was postponed indefinitely. By afternoon, Marin had made it home. She was still wearing yesterday's clothes, now stiff with dried salt water, both hands bandaged nearly to her wrists, and she went straight into the records office. Corinne Vance was sitting at the desk, with the old leather-bound ledger in front of her, the one she had kept locked in a drawer for 7 years and never allowed anyone to touch. She didn't rise. "They called me already," she said. Marin didn't answer. She walked over, placed her hand on the ledger, and pulled it toward herself. Corinne lifted a hand as if to stop her, but halfway there, that hand froze in the air, then fell back down. Marin opened it. 7 years lay contained inside, written in 3 colors of ink, exactly like the grid paper taped to the refrigerator door. Electricity, water, heating oil, room and board, unpaid. She turned a page, then another, then another. Around the middle of the ledger, between 2 pages of bills, several other sheets had been folded into quarters and tucked inside. She pulled them out, flattened them, and read, a promissory note. The borrower was Corinne Ann Doyle, her maiden name. The lender was a company called Harborline. Below that was the guarantor's signature, Emmett Crawl. The date was written in the upper corner. Marin looked at that date, then raised her eyes. "This was signed before you married my father." Corinne said nothing. Marin turned another page. The second sheet was a renewal agreement. So was the third. The fourth included an additional clause handwritten in the margin, in small letters, stating that the borrower agreed to provide access to collateral whenever the lender required it. Tucked separately at the bottom was a scrap torn from a desk calendar, with 2 hurried lines written in ballpoint pen, recording the very sentence Marin hadn't known existed a few days earlier, the sentence about the schedule changing and Mr. Barone going to inspect the south dock. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Elias Barone stopped in the doorway. He didn't come in. Corinne saw him and began speaking, fast, saying she hadn't known anything, that they had only told her to ask what the shipping schedule was, and send back one sentence in exchange for having a month of debt forgiven, that she had thought it was merely business, that everyone along the waterfront traded bits of information with one another. She spoke until she ran out of breath. No one interrupted her. "She's telling the truth," Elias said to Marin, without looking at Corinne. "I knew that from the day I got hold of that note. She didn't know what she was selling." Then he turned toward her, and his voice dropped very low. "But you knew where that yellow envelope had been all those 7 years. You knew what kind of paper you handed that girl to sign during the week of her father's funeral. No one deceived you about that." Corinne opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The leather ledger slipped from her hands, struck the wooden floor with a dry crack, and lay open there. She swayed, then had to brace both hands against the desk to keep from falling. She stood that way, her hands white, her neatly trimmed nails painted pale pink, pressed flat against the wood. "She has nothing," she said, and the words burst out like the last reflex of an animal with nowhere left to run. "She has nothing at all. No man would ever." "You're wrong," Elias said. He spoke so quietly that everyone in the room had to hold their breath to hear him. This was never about whether any man would choose to look at her. It's about the fact that she no longer needs you to look at her. Corinne turned toward Marin. She waited. She waited for a smile. She waited for the moment when her husband's stepdaughter would come over, lean down, and say something cruel enough to satisfy them both, because she had lived long enough to know people always did that, and perhaps for 7 years she had prepared herself for that moment, the way people prepared for a bill coming due. But Marin didn't smile. She bent down, picked up the ledger, closed it, and set it neatly on the desk. Then she took an envelope from her shirt pocket and placed it beside the book. 3 months' rent, she said. "The address is inside, across the bridge, near the church you like to go to. It has a gas heater." Corinne looked at the envelope as if it were some unfamiliar object. "There's only one condition," Marin said. "You don't come back to this yard. Not once." She straightened. "You think I'm doing this because I'm kind? I'm not. I'm doing it because my father married you, and because I don't want to look in the mirror someday and see the person who taught me how to count debts." She picked up her oilcloth bag. "You could have talked to me, any day in those 7 years. If you had just sat down and told me they were squeezing you, I would have stood beside you. I swear I would have." For the first time that day, her voice shook. "That's what you took from me, not the yard." Then she walked out. At the door, she stopped, bent down to the electric heater beneath the desk, and turned the knob all the way up. All 3 heating bars glowed red at once, and in that room, for the first time in 7 years, real warmth spread across the floor. That night, Marin sat alone in the engine room after the power had come back on. The leather-bound ledger opened before her, and she read it again from the beginning, this time slowly, one line at a time, because there was something in the final promissory note that had been catching in her mind, something she had not yet found the name for. She found it near the end of the book. There, tucked between 2 heating oil invoices, was a yellowed thermal printout, the kind the machines in the Harbor Authority office still produced when someone looked up a shipment. It listed a voyage number, named Harborline as the cargo owner, and beneath it was a line identifying the towing vessel. She knew the name of that tugboat. She had known it long before she knew how to read a contract. She sat for a long time with the slip of paper in her hand. Then she rose, put on her coat, and went uptown. The next day, she had a copy of the investigation file. Her lawyer obtained it from the Harbor Authority archives, some 40 pages thick and bound with rusted metal staples. She read every page in a single afternoon. The conclusion was on the last page, typed cleanly in 2 short lines, stating that the cause of the incident had been determined to be equipment failure, specifically the severing of the main tow line, and that no operational negligence had been found. The file had been closed after 3 months, but in the appendix, where the harbor activity logs from that night had been attached, there was one sheet she read again and again, until she knew it by heart. It was the loading schedule. Harborline's shipment had originally been placed 9th, which meant it was meant to leave the harbor on the following tide, after the storm had passed. Then, on the line below, was a note changing the order. The shipment had been moved up to 2nd place, sent out that very night. Beside the note was the box reserved for the approving signature. Inside that box were an office stamp and a signature. She took the whole file to the back room of the bakery the following afternoon, but before she could open her bag, Elias had placed a sheet of paper on the long table, turned it toward her, and pushed it across. She looked down. It was that same loading schedule, the original, not a copy. "I started looking for it the day I read Harborline's name in your yard records," he said. "I searched for 3 days. I found it the day before yesterday." Maren didn't touch the paper. "I could have chosen not to give this to you," Elias said. "No one knows it exists. The investigation file is closed. The man who signed the conclusion has retired. If I kept quiet, then for the rest of your life, all you'd know is that your husband died because a tow line snapped, and I'd still be sitting here, and everything would remain exactly the same." He placed both hands on the table. "Every week, my office approves dozens of schedule changes like that. Someone brings up a page, writes customer priority as the reason, and I sign it. I don't ask what's in the containers. I don't check the weather forecast. I don't know who will be the one sent to tow that cargo out into the channel in the middle of the night." His voice was still even, but it had slowed. "That isn't an excuse. I'm telling you so you'll know exactly what happened. Someone paid to have that shipment leave the harbor before the inspection team came down, and that person was Kroll. But what allowed it to leave was a signature. That signature was mine." No one spoke. Outside, somewhere down the slope, the rolling shutter of a shop was pulled down. Maren sat still for a long time. She looked at the signature box on the paper, at the round stamp pressed over one corner, and a picture came back to her with a clarity she had carried for 7 years. A kind man standing in the kitchen doorway in a raincoat, saying he only had to make one run and then he'd come home, while she nodded and didn't ask why he had to go out in the middle of a storm, didn't ask who was making him go, didn't ask anything at all, because back then she still believed silence meant peace. She lifted a hand, and for the first time in 7 years, she pulled the cord from beneath her collar, took the ring from it, and placed it on the table beside the paper. "Do you know what the worst part of the last 7 years has been?" she said. "Not the yard, not her. It was having no one to be angry with. They told me it was an accident. Who was I supposed to blame for an accident? The tow line? God?" She raised her eyes to him. "I spent 7 years blaming myself, because there was no one else left on that list." Elias didn't look away. "For 7 years, everyone has told me it was an accident," she said. "You're the first person who has told me that someone needs to be held responsible, even when that person is you." She picked up the paper, folded it in half, and put it into the oilcloth bag with everything else. "I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet," she said, "but I know one thing. If you'd hidden this from me, and someday I found it on my own, then you and she wouldn't be any different." She stood. "But now, you are." The lawyer reviewed the entire file, then told her plainly that it wasn't enough. The person who approved the schedule change didn't know what was in the shipment, and had no duty to know. The man who forced the run had paid through 3 layers of companies, and there wasn't a single line showing that he knew the forecast in advance. To bring a criminal case, they would have to prove intent, and intent lived inside a person's head, not on paper. The only thing this evidence could do was reopen the administrative file, forcing the harbor authority to review its procedures. It couldn't send anyone to prison. Maren listened to all of it, nodded, and asked where the petition needed to be filed. That afternoon, in the back room of the bakery, Elias set his phone on the long table and pushed it into the center. "Just say the word," he said, "not like what happened at the pier. No one has to lay a hand on anyone. I only need to make 4 calls in one morning. Those 3 ships out by the buoy will sit there until they rot. His bank will call him in. The union won't handle his cargo anymore. By next season, no one along this whole waterfront will remember his name." He looked at her. "I can do it. All you have to do is nod." Maren looked at the phone lying between them. She had thought about it for 2 nights. She had thought about it while changing the bandages on her hands, while sitting alone in the engine room listening to water slap beneath the dock. And she realized that the part of her that wanted to nod was still there, hot and tempting, promising a quick kind of relief. "No," she said. Elias didn't ask why. He only pulled the phone back. The Harbor Authority Board meeting took place in an old meeting room on the 2nd floor of the Port Administration Building, with a high ceiling, slow-turning ceiling fans, and several rows of wooden chairs. More people came than usual because rumors had traveled all along the waterfront in the past few days. There were ship owners. There were representatives from the Longshoremen's Union. There was an elderly secretary taking the minutes, and there were faces Marin remembered very clearly, people who had stood at her father's funeral and turned to one another to say that girl would never amount to anything, people who had called her the hired girl at Mrs. Vance's yard for 7 long years. She wore a clean work jacket, her hair tied back neatly, the tips of her fingers still wrapped in bandages. She went before the presiding table, set down the file, and spoke. She didn't talk about herself. She presented the loading schedule, pointed out the original 9th position and the revised 2nd position, read the weather forecast from that night and the wind threshold recommended by the harbor, then explained that the recommendation was only a recommendation, with no binding force, so no one had technically violated anything. She spoke slowly and clearly, never once raising her voice. Then she stopped. "I'd like to read 4 names," she said. The whole room went quiet. She read the chief engineer's name. She read the pilot's name. She read the youngest deckhand's name, a boy only 21 years old, on the 4th voyage of his life. Then she read her husband's name, Wyatt Ashby, assistant engineer. She read those 4 names very slowly, each one given its full weight, and after every name she left a silence long enough that someone in the room had to lower their head. "These 4 men didn't die because a tow line snapped," she said. "They died because a shipment had to leave the harbor before the inspection team came down. And in this entire harbor process, there wasn't a single point where anyone was required to stop and say no." She placed a hand on the file. "I know this isn't enough to take anyone to court. My lawyer told me that plainly. I didn't come here to demand that anyone go to prison." She looked up around the room. "I came to ask you to change 1 line in the regulations." Then she read the petition. It was very short. Whenever the forecast exceeded the established wind and wave threshold, all towing operations out into the channel would be postponed, with no exceptions at a customer's request, no authority to approve a change in loading order during that window, and anyone who signed approval in violation of the rule would bear personal responsibility under their own name on the document. She folded the paper. "Someone asked me why I didn't choose another way," she said. "There's a much faster way. A few phone calls, and the man behind that shipment would disappear from this waterfront. And I'll be honest, I thought about it for 2 nights straight." She looked down at the 4 names on the sheet before her. But what would it change if he disappeared? Next season, someone else would need a shipment moved out in a hurry. Another request would be brought forward. Another person would sign it. Another vessel would head into the channel in the middle of a storm. Then there would be more names for someone else to stand here and read. Her voice grew rough. "I don't need him to disappear. I need that night to never be allowed to happen again." At the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe, Elias Barone listened to every word. He didn't come inside. He only stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at her from beginning to end, with the expression of a man who had just been shown a kind of power he had never known existed. The petition was brought to a vote at the next meeting, and passed with 2 votes against it. When the official order was issued and posted on the bulletin board outside the Harbor Authority office, the first line gave the regulation its customary short name, taken from the person connected to the incident that had led to it: the Ashby Rule.